Hello, I have 1,000,001 whiteboards in my house, but only one whiteboard eraser, and this will not do, therefore I shall make more out of fabric. Now, the technique I'm going to be using is called the chenille technique, so I guess come along if you want to learn this technique, and also make some whiteboard eraser scrubbies. Yeah. I want to make them so they kind of like wrap around my hand and then close at the top with a snap, so then I could like snap it on my hand and then use my hand to erase the whiteboard. So in order to decide how big it's going to be, I'm going to have to measure how big around my hand is, and my hand is about 8 inches around, and it's going to have to overlap a little bit, so I think I'm going to just be lazy and make it 10 inches. And then in terms of like length, maybe like 3 inches. So I need some rectangles that are 10 inches by 3 inches. We're not worrying about seam allowance because there's not actually going to be any seams involved. This ruler is going to be perfect because this ruler is literally 3 inches wide, so I just have to cut them 10-inch long. I'm going to keep this thing nice and simple and just have 3 layers of flannelette. When you're doing the chenille technique, you can, technically speaking, do as many layers of flannelette as you'd like. Okay, this is a very much do as I say and not as I do situation, but I am ambidextrous enough that I can do simple shortcuts with my left hand. If you're not ambidextrous, do not ever do this. Okay, so she is now 3 by 10 inches and should wrap around my hand beautifully for me to use to erase my whiteboard. Now, for this technique, it's very important. You're going to have one fabric facing one direction, and then all of your other fabrics, however many layers you have, facing the other direction, because this is going to be the back and these guys are going to be on the front. Another thing you have to make sure is that when you cut these things out, they have to be on the straight of grain, because this is going to make sense later. All the lines we sew are going to be on a 45-degree diagonal. Very easy to mark that out. If I just take my ruler, I'm going to line up the 45-degree line with the bottom down here, and then I could just take my pencil, chalk, whatever, and draw my line. And all of my lines that you can't see very well because it's green is going to be along that 45 degrees. Excuse the mess everywhere else, but this is a project in which having a thread rug really comes in handy. I've done that first 45-degree line, and now I'm going to take this little guy, and on my presser foot right back here, there's a little screw right here. This little screw, I'm going to undo it to open it up, and then I should be able to stick this right inside like that, and then I can adjust this bar to wherever I want it to be in order to be able to sew parallel lines like that. So now I can turn my sewing machine back on. And you'll notice this line is like a little bit, I want to say about ½ an inch away from the needle. So I'm going to keep sewing, and I'm going to line up this existing line with this guy. And then that way I can sew lots of parallel lines at 45 degrees. And then once I'm done that, sew onto my thread rug, cut the thread, and I can just keep going over and over and over until I've actually managed to cover this entire piece of fabric. Now, this technique kind of takes forever, but it is very important to be able to sew diagonal lines on the bias of the fabric that are parallel to each other, because that in itself is integral to the chenille technique that we're doing right now. You can also flip it over and sew it from the back instead of the front like I'm doing here. Okay, so now I've got all my parallel lines sewed on the diagonal, and the reason why the diagonal is so important is because on my fabric there are threads going side to side and there are threads going up and down, but there are no threads going on a diagonal, aka the bias of the fabric, which means that when I cut a fabric on a diagonal, theoretically it shouldn't fray because there are no threads to fray off. In practice, however, what actually happens is biases do fray, but only only by a slight amount, and that will give me like a nice fuzzy edge, which is exactly what I want for this whiteboard eraser. This is when we need one of these guys. Now this guy is a special chenille cutter. This one's by Olfa, but you could use whatever brand you want. And it has little tiny thingies at different sizes. And these little thingies are meant to slide underneath the back of the fabric and cut all the top layers of fabric. Another important thing to note, this thing does actually have a guide, like a blocker to block all the blades that you're not cutting with. So if I turn it this way, you can see that guide switches to large, which is the biggest thing at the bottom, to small, which is super duper skinny if your parallel lines are much closer together, and then medium, same thing for large. There is an actual rotary cutter blade inside this, and I'm pretty sure it's a 60mm rotary cutter blade. So if I turn this way, I can get that blade inside to turn to a different angle, which means I get a fresh, sharp section of the blade to cut with. So I'm just going to take that little yellow part, slide it in between the back of my fabric and whatever top layers I have. In my case, it's 2. Your case might be different. And I just have to shove that forward and it will cut all of the top layers, but not the bottom layer. And sometimes it's a little bit finicky to get started, but you should eventually get the hang of it. Then you just have to multiply that by however many channels you've got sewn in between all those parallel lines of diagonal stitching. And yes, this does take a while. Look at that texture. Now, I do want to note my one tiny critique of this tool is that the fuzz kind of gets stuck in there, and removing fuzz from that area is kind of dangerous because that's the sharp area. So I recommend using a pin or some other sort of tool to get in there to try and get the fuzz out instead of going in with your fingers, because if you go in with your fingers, well, that's when your fingers are in danger of getting sliced. Thankfully, they're not usually too difficult to remove. But Olfa, if you're watching this, you should totally sponsor me and, I don't know, maybe figure out a way to get around this mild annoyance. Because if you're just cutting a few things like this, which is very small, it's not too bad. But if you're cutting like a giant quilt, oh my god, you have to do this and stop and clear out the fuzz so often. Alrighty, once I've got all of the pieces cut out, the more this is used, the more these little cuts will start fuzzing up. And you can also throw this in the dryer to speed up the process of getting all these guys to fuzz up. But now I need to put a binding all around the raw edges so that I don't have raw edges. Well, I don't have raw edges that I don't want to be raw, like these guys. I have a little bit of leftover bias binding from some other project, so I'm going to use this. Okay, over here at the sewing machine, I'm just going to start sewing this on. I'm going to fold this initial edge down just a smidge before I put it right sides together with the top of it and start stitching. I'm going to stitch nice and close to the edge because this is not a very wide bias tape. And I didn't back stitch on these things because this is now going to get anchored in by this bias binding, but do make sure to back stitch here. Editing Coco here, who is now realizing that I did this first corner incorrectly. But basically, you sew up to the corner, and you see that bottom edge right there, and that top edge right there. I'm going to instead pretend wherever that stitching line actually is, away from the corner, I'm going to sew up to that stitching line, and this is where I did it incorrectly on this first corner. Because when I reach the corner of where the stitching line is, not the edge of the fabric, but the end of the stitching line corner, I'm supposed to sew at a 45 degrees into the corner of the actual edge of the fabric. And I did not do that here, but you will see me do that now on the other corner. And then I just cut the thread. And then I put the fabric straight up at a 180 degrees away from the new edge that I'm about to sew before folding it straight down. And that fold up at the top is aligned with the edge of my fabric up at the top, and I backstitch and I just sew in a straight line down the edge again with my regular old seam allowance. And here I'm coming over to my next corner. I'm going to do that exact same thing for all 4 corners, and this is one of the areas where I will actually slow down and take my time. And yes, I am now realizing that I'm going to have to add a more detailed tutorial on how to do mitered corners in a future video. Okay, once I get back to the beginning again, I'm going to overlap a little bit and then just chop this off, and then I'm going to stitch so that it comes in line with this existing line of stitching. If I'm feeling extra fancy, I might offset this just a teensy bit so that the next step will be a little bit easier. Perfect. From here, I'm going to flip this all over to the wrong side. If you'd like, you can in fact iron this. I am lazy and don't enjoy ironing. On this side though, once it is pulled taut, I'm going to fold this over and then fold it in half again. If I wanted this to be super duper pretty, I'd try to top stitch it. If I don't care and care more about just catching it, I'd do it from this side. I think I'm going to try and make it pretty. So, fold, and you'll see this folded edge is slightly past that line of stitching, which means it covers that line of stitching, but it also means when I'm sewing from this side and I'm stitching in the ditch right there, I will be sure to catch this folded edge. And that is why this is kind of tricky if you're doing it from the top edge, because if you don't get it right, you're not gonna catch it, which is why ironing can indeed make this significantly easier. You could also, instead of stitching in the ditch right here, you could just stitch slightly over onto this binding, which then increases your chances of actually catching the back. So I think I'm going to do that. I'm going to stitch slightly over onto the edge. That way I can be sure I catch this back part. So looking right here, I'm lining up this edge with this inside edge of the gap in my presser foot, and which means my needle is going to stitch slightly beside that, which means I'm going to be stitching slightly on here. Corners are always tricky. You have to fold them both like you fold it in, and then you have to there we go. Sometimes you'll have to readjust as you get closer, which is always the most annoying part. If you're feeling unconfident about this, I would just hand stitch it. I'm just feeling more impatient than anything. Once I get to the corner, needle down and just pivot. Ooh, being annoying. So on this corner, I'm going to fold this over, which is the same amount I folded over everywhere. Fold this side over first, and then fold this side down like that, and it should give you a nice little mitered corner. Now, if you're having trouble to getting this back part to line up, but this is actually one of the trickiest sections, you should go check out my video on slip stitching to learn how to just hand stitch this down instead in a way that looks way neater, but just takes a little bit longer. Woohoo! I got a cute little thingamabob now. Oh, ignore all the threads. I'm gonna go clean that up a little bit. Okay, so now that I have this, I need to add snaps so that I can overlap this on my hand, snap it closed, and then just go and wipe my thingy closed. So I have these snaps right here, and I have this cam snap press. And the way this works, this piece is for both sides of the snap. This is the back of the snap. This is the front of the, this is one side of the part that this is supposed to snap into. So the bottom pieces are different, the top pieces are the same. With the top piece, I'm going to shove this through the middle, right around there, which is very handy because it literally is sharp. So I should, with a bit of coaxing, be able to just shove that through like that. And then I can stick this, make sure this is going the right way, because these two fit together like that. So yes, this has to be up like this. And then I take this part. The back is meant for the round piece, and then the front has a little metal thing right in there that kind of squishes this sharp part to be sort of flat and keeps it from falling apart. So I put it on like that, give it a good squeeze, and you can see that sharp part that stabbed through everything is now squished flat and holds this in place. Once I have that, I need to make sure to get the other side. So I want it to be right around there. My measurements are so precise right now. Right around there. Stab that through. And it is a good thing to double check. Yes, this is the way things want to snap closed. Otherwise, you might install it upside down, which, no judgments, but it will be very frustrating. And squeeze! And you see it's been squished flat, and now this thing should be able to come around, snap closed, and I should be able to slide my hand on it and go erase my whiteboard. Test number 1. Put this on my hand and uh-oh, come on. Oh, okay, in my defense, this drawing was a few days old. It was from when I filmed my dog bed video, so the ink's kind of dry. But yes, it does work. And the best thing is, once this is done, I can just toss this in the washing machine and wash it with my reusable Swiffers and other various household goods that I've made out of fabric. I also use my mirrors as whiteboards sometimes, so I can erase the Chanel whiteboard erasers with my Chanel whiteboard eraser. This was a lovely quick project. I really enjoyed doing this. Now, I will say I did use quite a few specialty tools when it comes to the snaps. So if you don't have a handy dandy snap press like this, you could of course just use these little guys that you could just hand sew on. If you don't have this specific chenille cutter, I'm sure there are other brands that you could use, or you could manually go in with like a little pair of tiny scissors to cut some of the layers without cutting the back piece. I do want to note that if you are going to be doing this chenille technique, I do recommend you use a woven fabric. Specifically, a flannelette would be best, but the fact that the fabric is woven is what allows this bias cut edge to eventually fray just a little bit over time, but not too much. I hope you enjoyed this project and the chaos involved, and if you do not have the ability to very finically sew down this by machine, honestly there's some areas where I didn't quite do it very nice because there's some raw edges still peeking out. You could of course hand sew it with a slip stitch. If you go check out my slip stitching video, which should be out by the time this video is out, you can see how you could do it by hand instead. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll see you next time. Happy sewing!